We begin episode 1 of Lupin with Arsène Diop marveling at a necklace kept in the Louvre. He's clearly plotting his next move, while posing as a cleaner there. This necklace, as we soon find out, belonged to Marie Antoinette and will be put up for auction in a week's time. This happens to be the date Arsène is going to make his move. It turns out Arsène is working with a trio of thugs who seem to hold influence over him. After threatening him over a balcony, Arsène briefs Vincent, Kevin, and Rudy over their upcoming gig. He encourages them to head in as janitors. When the auction starts, they'll have 7 minutes to escape without being caught. If they can do that and get away in a discreet, speedy car, they'll be laughing all the way to the bank. Just before the operation, we cut back to a very rainy Paris in 1995. A young Arsène and his father managed to bag a lift from a lady having trouble with her car. When they swab their way into getting a life, Arsène pauses over the lady, calling his father a gentleman. Arsène is close with his father too and clearly has bad blood with the Pellegrini family. When his father is framed and thrown in prison, Arsène's father subsequently commits suicide. This leaves Arsène with quite the chip on his shoulder, muddied further by the fact he knows Juliette Pellegrini pretty well. Back in the present, Arsène arrives at the Louvre for the night under a fake alias. He's cool and collected, ready to steal the necklace as our three stooges get into position. Anyway, the auction goes ahead, and right on cue, our trio of lackeys get to work overpowering the security. In fact, this entire stunt is really cleverly constructed, jumping back in time to see extra fragments of the past, while jumping between Arsène and the janitors as the heist goes ahead. The cameras are shut off and Arsène immediately gets into position, winning the bid for Marie Antoinette's necklace for a princely sum of 60 million euros. Kevin and Vincent worry that Arsène will betray them and decide to make that very move themselves. As alarms wail, they hurry off with the necklace as Arsène is left tied up in the back. They hurry away from the Louvre, joined by Rudy in a sports car, as police chase them, while hot on their heels. Eventually they manage to run the car off the road and straight back into the Louvre again. As the trio are taken to the station, the officer on duty discusses Arsène Lupin and how the necklace incident reminded him of that gentleman thief. It's a nice nod toward the present as Arsène is let go, but with the inspector remaining suspicious of him. In fact, that nod toward Arsène Lupin is more than a nod. Arsène has based his entire heist on this fictional detective. We then jump back 2 weeks earlier as Arsène hears news about the Queen's necklace being found. Based on this, he sets to work getting a job as a janitor and intentionally using Vincent and the others for his own devices as all the pieces of the puzzle come together. The piece de resistance? Arsène switched the necklace around for a fake and actually stashed the real one in a bin inside the Louvre. Dressed as a janitor, he manages to steal the necklace and takes it out with the trash without anyone suspecting him. As the episode closes out, Arsène arrives at Claire's house to pick up his son Raoul. As he does, the legacy continues as he hands over an Arsène Lupin. We begin episode 2 of Lupin with Arsène being brought into prison. He's introduced to his new cellmate as Arsène's time appears to be up. We then cut back 2 days earlier as Raoul looks around the jewelers. In the back, Arsène learns from his friend Benjamin, who owns the place, that this necklace has never been pulled apart. This means that Pellegrini and the family lied about it going missing. But why? Before they can ponder that further, however, the duo are interrupted by Raoul showing up. Elsewhere, Juliette greets her mother, who warns the girl to be careful. Downstairs, Juliette receives a note telling her to meet at Luxembourg Gardens at 2 p.m. with no police. Along with the note happens to be a single diamond. Dressed as a delivery driver, Arsène rocks up by the shoreside. He covers up Juliette's microphone and obscures his face, knowing she's being watched, and admits he stole the necklace. He wants answers. It turns out Juliette and her father both came up with the idea of separating the gemstones to drum up publicity. She pleads with Arsène to hand over the necklace and admits that Arsène's father signed a confession confirming he was guilty. Realizing the jig is up, Arsène takes off on his bike and evades the police, who are baffled by a number of other delivery drivers showing up at the same spot. It turns out Arsène has switched disguises and manages to get away without being spotted. Going back through his father's belongings, Asane remembers Babaker telling him that spelling is very important. Within his letter to Asane are the words Comet and Liberis, which don't seem like accidental mistakes. Asane figures out that the former refers to a man in prison with the same surname, Etienne Comet, and library as a straight translation. Both of these could potentially lead to his father's innocence being proven. In order to do this though, Asane infiltrates the prison, switching places with a man named Gibril to get closer to Etienne. Juliet meanwhile comes under fire from the inspectors who question whether she actually knew Asane or not. She deflects the line of enquiry, though, and asks the captain to find the necklace. In flashbacks to 1995, we see Asane approached by Dumont, who tells him to pack his things and leave. As he does, he bundles the Arsène Lupin book in his bag and tries to evade Dumont. Try being the operative word though, as he's eventually captured. That capture sees him brought into juvenile prison, where he's handed a Bible and forced to settle in. Asane refuses to play with the other kids as he receives a letter from his father, a letter sent while the police cleaned out his cell. The inspector gently mentions Andrecy School, the best private school in France, and a donor who has paid for him to receive the best education there. Back in prison, Asane meets Comet, after getting himself stabbed in the stomach by a dope-hungry gang demanding he deliver. He explains to Comet that he's Babaker's son, allowing Etienne to speak openly. It turns out Babaker was alone in his cell and under surveillance. Etienne wasn't there, but tells Asane to look through his belongings where a book lies that holds the clues he seeks. Back at the police station, Yousef Gadira continues to research into Arsène Lupin and decodes the names to realize they're all anagrams for Lupin. There's a clear connection between the thief and the fictional detective, but for now, he doesn't have much else to go on. Back in prison, Asane looks through Etienne's belongings and finds a Lupin book. Using this, he decodes a message reading, "An innocent trapped by Anne Pellegrini." Asane heads back to Etienne and thanks him for his help, promising to do his best to clear his father's name. Back in prison, Asane is found in the showers after hanging himself. The nurses rush in to take him to hospital as we learn Asane concocted all of this on purpose to find a way out of prison. Asane eventually shows up at Pellegrini's apartment and tells Anne she's responsible for framing his father. It turns out she forced him to sign a confession. This was supposed to guarantee him a shorter sentence, but unfortunately the judge was too harsh, and he was put away for a long time. Babaker then hung himself as he couldn't cope with the guilt and shame. That generous donor that brought Asane to the prestigious school happens to be Anne Pellegrini too. The officer who lied and betrayed his family happens to be none other than Inspector Dumont. The very same Inspector Dumont from Asane's past. As he gets researching, Asane learns that the inspect is currently working for the Paris Regional Police. The game is Episode 3 of Lupin begins with crooked cop Dumont getting ready for the day ahead. With cameras planted all around the house, Asane easily hacks in and begins watching and studying his routine. The first part of his plan comes from posing as a technician called Max. He makes a big song and dance about porn on his computer, eventually taking Dumont into a secluded hallway at work, where he knocks the man out. Destroying his SIM card and bundling him into a trunk, he takes off in a van. Armed with a distorted voice, Asane interrogates Dumont, who happens to be tied to a chair. Asane begins questioning this man about Babaker. Given Dumont's name is directly linked to all the files on his father, Asane asks outright exactly why he tried to frame him. Dumont shakes his head though, telling Asane he's got it all wrong. Dumont seems to have done his research too, and mentions the Louvre and how he could be connected to that. Asane's wry smile soon fades as he presses a button and has the TV playing again, sliding through a series of different inmates with dirty records. Those records happen to link straight back to wiring money to the commissioner. We then jump back to 1995 as Dumont arrives at Hubert Pellegrini's and exhibits doubts over Babaker being the one responsible for taking his necklace. Given Hubert increased the value of the necklace after it was taken, it makes him seem a little suspicious. Elsewhere in the past, we see Claire and Asane growing closer together at the private school as the former tells Asane about a story involving knights and barbarians. Back in the present, the police catch wind of Dumont's disappearance and begin a manhunt to try and find him. While they track down the van, Asane threatens Dumont with deepfake videos before blowing his cover and revealing that he's Babaker's son. Asane realizes his time is up and leaves Dumont tied to his chair. He hurries outside before the police eventually find Dumont. With Asane back in hiding, Dumont returns home and immediately starts taking down all the hidden cameras around his house. Asane watches disapprovingly on his monitor. As we jump back in time to 1995, Dumont believes Babaker is innocent and mentions to Pellegrini how the man's alibi doesn't match up. Dumont promises to see this investigation through to its conclusion until Hubert threatens his family. This is why he was forced to put Babaker away and make him sign a confession. As we soon find out, Hubert also hid this from his wife too. As the episode comes to a close, Dumont decides to speak up about Babaker and how there's another party involved. That conversation he makes happens to be to Hubert Pellegrini. When Juliet returns home and hears the message herself, Asane smiles confidently in his office, killing two birds with one stone. Not only does he know there's another party involved, Juliet now sees Dumont's true color. We begin episode 4 of Lupin with a drone buzzing through the Pellegrini apartment. With lasers shining in his office, this drone flies effortlessly past them and begins buzzing around papers on the table. On the way out, this drone sets off the alarms as guards flood into the room. The drone eventually collapses on the ground with a single note attached, "I'll get you." Up on the roof, Asane sits with the controller. Asane catches up with Dumont at a cafe and asks him about Pellegrini. He promises to leave the detective alone as Dumont spills details about a journalist known as Fabienne Bayreuth. She happens to be Asane's next port of call. This immediately sees him head online to do some research, buying Fabienne's book and deep diving into exactly what this woman knows. Asane eventually heads over to her house, introducing himself as a fan and asking about Pellegrini. He admits they both have the same motivation, to take him down. Fabienne is a shadow of the courageous, spunky woman she once was, broken down by the system Pellegrini has worked so hard to establish. Eventually she rejects the call to action and sends him away, at least momentarily anyway. It turns out Fabienne has been blacklisted, and with nothing left, she also has nothing else to lose either. She agrees to help Asane, who in turn introduces her to his base of operations. Now the dots start connecting, as Fabienne realizes 1995 is the year Pellegrini's company was on the verge of collapsing. He frames Asane's father, collects the insurance money, and saves the company. It all slots together like the pieces of a dastardly puzzle. Using the coward trick, Asane dons a new disguise as Fabienne rings from outside, allowing Asane to head up and retrieve a VHS tape from the archives. Hurrying away, Asane brings this crucial piece of evidence back to Fabienne. It turns out this tape holds incriminating evidence against Pellegrini, specifically about a gun deal he was involved in with thugs in Kuala Lumpur back in 1996. Realizing how big this is, Asane decides to launch this on Twitter and cause absolute havoc for Pellegrini. Back at the police station, Gadira speaks to Dumont about the connection this case has to Arsène Lupin and how the thief is a copycat of that fictional detective. Working inside the police station, Dumont continues to keep Hubert updated. The officers are closing in too, starting a facial recognition run with numerous different eyewitnesses. Unfortunately, every picture they have is completely different thanks to all of Asane's different disguises. Dumont loses patience and eventually takes Gadira off the case. Gadira is convinced Dumont is part of all this, though, and refuses to accept this dismissal. Hubert Pellegrini holds a press conference surrounding the blackmail outside his place. He tells the reporters that it's complete slander and holds absolutely no weight. He even challenges Asane on TV to release what he has on him. When Fabienne suddenly shows up and asks about Kuala Lumpur, he ends the press conference and walks away. Fabienne heads home, but quickly realizes she's being followed through the streets of Paris. Thankfully, she makes it back to her apartment before she can be caught. That evening, she helps Asane don a new disguise before heading onto TV to reveal the evidence he's found. As a present, Asane hands over a pen and encourages Fabienne to write again. Dressed as an old man disguise, Asane heads onto TV and mentions the attack on the French embassy. With the videotape in hand, he begins playing, but unfortunately Hubert has managed to distort the message to save himself. Realizing he's been set up, Asane quickly fights his way outside as Hubert rallies the guards to try and track down Asane. Just as he does, he receives a call from Juliet who claims that this Salvator character is actually Asane Diop. Fabienne realizes her gig is up and quickly leaves a note in her book. As she opens the door, Pellegrini's right-hand man arrives and demands to know where Asane is. She smiles and tells him a journalist never reveals her source. When Asane returns to the apartment, he finds Fabienne hanging from the rafters. With the dog under his arm, Asane struggles to hold it together. Picking up the Pellegrini book, he reads her message left behind for him, promising to fight together against this, despite losing the initial battle. As the episode closes out, Gadira figures out Asane's. Episode 5 of Lupin begins with news breaking about Fabienne's death. Speaking to Ben, Asane blames himself for getting her involved. Wondering whether to quit or not, Ben reminds him he has a wife and child, his priorities should lie with them. Given Asane made a promise to Raoul, he decides to drop this for now. Back at the police station, Gadira continues to research, putting all the pieces together alongside Asane's face. Although Gadira isn't officially on the case, he's determined to figure out the truth. Pellegrini has his thug tail Asane, but our gentleman thief quickly figures it out and evades him, hurrying to the rooftops. He salutes the thug and makes it to Raoul for his birthday, where he hands over a top hat as a gift. As we cut back in time to 2006, we see Claire in therapy talking about Asane and his job. Or, well, her lack of understanding surround exactly what he does. Claire starts to doubt herself and isn't sure whether Asane is her soulmate or not. Given she's pregnant, it just makes things that much more difficult. 2006 Asane is a master conman disguised as a gentleman, encouraging a wealthy lady to hand over her valuables after fooling the police outside. He promises to take them down to the station and eventually takes off. This brings him to Benjamin where he hands over the prize. Ben is thoroughly impressed with his spoils, but Asane is distracted. In fact, he's distracted by Juliet who arrives and heads into one of the rooms nearby. Asane follows and the two flirt together, confirming they've been involved in an affair together. Asane decides to break things off, claiming he loves Claire. Things are tense between him and Claire though, until she reveals that she's pregnant. Asane can hardly disguise his smile as he tells everyone in the restaurant he's going to be a dad. Back in the present, Raoul and Claire take off with Asane as part of the former's birthday celebrations. After snapping a selfie together on the train, Asane spies Pellegrini's thug behind them in the carriage. Asane leads the man up the carriage away from his family, eventually locking him in a storage room and heading back to his family. Unfortunately, it's short-lived given the thug returns and sits next to Raoul. Realizing they're in trouble, Asane does his best to hold his nerve. In fact, he drops a message for the captain under the Paul Cernine alias, thanking him for the pen. It's enough for the police to rally, finding the train and arresting Pellegrini's man, who Asane frames with a diamond in the pocket. Beaumont quickly dismisses this though, allowing the man to go free while Asane slips away. Asane and Claire get talking about their future, but unfortunately lose Raoul down by the beach. Given he's wearing a top hat, the horrible irony here is that the kid is taken using the exact same method Asane has been using to evade capture. As part 1 of Lupin comes to a close, Raoul is bundled into the car by Pellegrini's man, while Gadira finds Asane and calls him Lupin. Season 1 of Lupin comes to a dramatic mid-season closure, with lots of questions hanging over this one. The cliffhanger here isn't too annoying, especially given we know part 2 has already been greenlit and will come in the near future. For the time being though, Lupin delivers an exciting 5 episodes of heist thrills and espionage action, leaving the door wide open for where the second half may go. Asane's character is well written too, and although the middle chapters are a little slow and the police officers sadly underdeveloped, there's enough here to enjoy nonetheless. Although none of the episodes match the brilliance of that opening heist at the Louvre, the rest of the season has been a solid and enjoyable watch nonetheless. If the second part is as solid as this one, we could be in for quite the ride. If you want part 2 recap, do not forget to check link in description below. Lupin is a well-written heist thriller adopting the name of Arsène Lupin and twisting that to fit a modern audience. Instead of rewriting what's come before, though, Lupin draws inspiration from the fictional thief to create something wholly new and exciting. With echoes of a Nime series great detective, sprinklings of Carmen Sandiego and the grittiness of detective shows like Luther, Lupin draws a medley of ideas together to create a harmonious symphony of noise that hits all the right notes. At the centerpiece of all this is our gentleman thief, Arsène Diop. Determined to gain justice for the death of his father, what begins as a cleverly written heist at the Louvre soon encapsulates all of Paris as the police jump in to try and capture this elusive thief. All the while, Arsène remains determined to narrow down his search and learn the truth. Given the season is split into 2 parts, part 1 is a brisk 5-episode romp that introduces our characters, the main conflict and the high stakes, setting everything up nicely for a second part that promises to be every bit as exciting and action-packed as this one. Complicating matters further in this espionage thriller is Pellegrini's mysterious daughter Juliette and crooked cop Inspector Dumont. Both these characters happen to have direct ties to Arsène's past that are drip-fed through the story over time. The plot is well-paced, with enough high-stake obstacles for Arsène to overcome. You genuinely feel tension every time Arsène becomes involved in another elaborate scheme. The 5 episodes also see Arsène use a range of different skills on his mission, including drones, disguises and conventional decoding. There's an air of Jason Bourne in a lot of this, but Arsène's human touch and obvious flaws help the show stand out and give Arsène an air of believability. Rather than an unstoppable all-knowing force like Sherlock, Arsène is instantly relatable. A couple of the episodes have great reveals too, going back to show how something has played out from a different perspective, or how Arsène has completed his objective while eluding everyone including the audience. These moments work beautifully to pay off some of the slower segments of the show. These are few and far between though in truth, especially given Lupin throws in a lot of flashes to Arsène's childhood. There's also several jumps back in time to several days or weeks prior to a teasing scene at the start of the episode. While it works perfectly during episode 1's opening heist, the rest of the season does suffer a little by rehashing this same concept. It's not a deal breaker, but by the end of episode 5, these moments do outstay their welcome a little. Still, this is a minor gripe in what's otherwise a highly enjoyable and engaging 5 episodes of action. The ending here sets the scene nicely for the second part to come, and the various nods toward the Arsène Lupin books are a great way to pay homage to what's come before. Those expecting a remake or a modernized version of the fictional thief will be disappointed, but this modern reimagined based on version is actually really compelling and one of 2021's brighter spots so far.